Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
It's not as if people undertook research first and then sat down to write. Research is an ongoing process that happens if you're alert to your surroundings. It happens all the time. I mean, of course, as a historian, I have certain methods. And in this book, I deploy certain methods to recover certain archives. They're not state archives. They're extremely ephemeral archives of film societies. But again, I have to decode them to see what aspirations they embody. Like, why would a group of people, about 100,000, I think, at its height of the film society movement, why would they be so invested in watching non-Hollywood, non-Indian language films or non-mainstream Indian language films, and that too under terrible conditions?
The project of Indian art cinema began in the years following independence in 1947, at once evoking the global reach of the term quote-unquote art film and speaking to the aspirations of the new nation-state. This episode of BIC Talks is a conversation between an author and a historian who are both invested in the histories of cinema and the city, Kolkata in particular. Using ideas in the book Art Cinema and India's Forgotten Futures as a fulcrum, novelist, essayist and musician Amit Chaudhuri speaks to Associate Professor, Departments of South Asian Languages and Civilizations and Cinema and Media Studies, University of Chicago, Rochona Majumdar, about the role of art films in postcolonial public life. This episode is an extract from a BIC Streams event that took place on November 18th, 2021. And now, over to Amit and Rochona.
Thank you, Lekha, and thank you, Bangalore International Centre, for arranging this. And Rochona, thank you for asking me to, be part of this evening. For us evening, for you morning, right? So the way we're going to do this, and now I'm addressing people I can only imagine. I can't see you. We're going to introduce each other. I'll start by saying, giving a very cursory introduction to Rochona, and then say a tiny bit about her new book, which is the reason why we're here today, talking about the journeys of the art film in India. And then once we are done with that, we are going to attempt, although we don't have a moderator to help us, we are going to attempt to do what we want to do, which is hear each other speak about why this particular topic or theme or this particular subject is of interest to us and has been of interest to us for a very long time. So we are going to ask each other questions. We are each going to be both, presenter and moderator in that sense. So let me begin by saying that Rochona Majumdar is an associate professor. I mean, you have this information already, but let me say it again, is an associate professor in the departments of South Asian Languages and Civilizations and Cinema and Media Studies at the University of Chicago. She is the author of Marriage and Modernity, Family Values in Colonial Bengal, which was published by Duke University Press in 2009, and Writing Postcolonial History, which was published by Bloomsbury in 2010. And most recently, and this is the book that I referred to earlier, Art Cinema and India's Forgotten Futures, Film and History in the Post-Colony, Columbia University Press, 2021. Here is the book, which is a very absorbing, often gripping book, a kind of engagement with a kind of cultural, artistic, cinematic history, but also individual practices, artistic practices on the part of primarily three filmmakers, Satyajit Ray, Ritik Ghatak, and Mrinal Sen. I also like the various things that are being tried out here, the various marriages that are taking place here between history writing and criticism, between the idea of the postcolonial as a parameter, but also ideas to do with the poetic and art. The word that figures in the title of our talk today and also in the title of Rochona's book. I think these marriages are more unusual than one would suspect. So in many ways, those are part of the reason why the book is absorbing, why it grips you. So Rochona, over to you before we start with our tete-a-tete.
Well, Amit Chaudhuri, for the viewers who don't know him, which I imagine would be a very small handful, wears many hats. And he asked me in his characteristic, candid way why I wanted to be in conversation with him. And I mean, you all know that he's an author, he's a performing artist, he writes on music, criticism, he's a literary activist, a poet. He's written many novels, 3 books of poetry. His most recent book, I believe, is Finding the Raga. Have you written something even after that, Amit?
No.
Or am I a little bit? Yes. So Finding the Raga is a book, again, an intensely personal, but also a reflective, theoretical book on music. But my reason for asking Amit to share the platform today is because something that Lekha said right at the beginning, that we're both deeply interested in Kolkata, our city. And Amit actually is someone who, from his works, I know, made the decision sometime in 1999, was it, to make Kolkata your home. And I was very interested in speaking with a practitioner who also writes about film occasionally, but that's certainly not the only thing that you write about. But I mean, you have this engagement with Kolkata and the world that was in many ways reminiscent of the world that I'm trying to recreate in the book. And in lots of ways also not. So I just thought it would be, this is not an introduction, but it's also, I'm trying to explain one of the reasons why I thought it would be good to bring or to stage our conversation in public. I mean, you and I talk over the last 2 years due to COVID less frequently than we'd like, but let's see where this conversation goes.
So to tell you what I have in mind to start off, let me just say that I'm planning to ask you 2 sets of questions to begin with, and each one is a kind of a pair. 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. Sorry, I hope this doesn't sound like an exam. I wanted to cover a few things with sets of questions. Sure. So 1A, 1B. So the first 2 questions, which I want you to kind of consider. The first is very bland, but it's a subject of real curiosity for me. Why did you write this book on cinema, on art cinema, art films? Given, I know you are engaged in film, you're part of the kind of film study department, that kind of goes into what you do in Chicago. Nevertheless, it is an interesting movement from your previous 2 books, and this one, obviously, it has been sort of germinating in you, and then you've been writing it for a while. So this is one question, this turn towards something which isn't maybe written about as much as it should be, cinema and art house cinema. Then your comment, which you also you mentioned this towards the end of your introduction, that you felt that these filmmakers were remarkable as well. They began their work in the 50s and then they continue after that. Remarkable for prefiguring some of what critical historians would say later on. So in what way, for the kind of sake of our audience, I think they would also be interested in this insight of yours.
Thank you, Amit. They're both important questions and generative questions. And I hope I don't ramble. If I do, just stop me. So why this particular topic? I should say that when I was growing up in Kolkata, we knew that, vaguely, that there was a distinction between art and commercial films. But in my house, we watched everything. My father was a huge fan of Uttam Kumar Suchitra Sen, Uttam Kumar Sabitri, Uttam Kumar Supriya Devi. He watched everything, and he loved melodramas, and he would weep copiously. My mother was a little more disciplined and didn't like for us to watch Bengali mainstream or Hindi commercial films, but we did, really. And then on Doordarshan, we watched these black and white films. So, I didn't grow up with, how shall I put it, with much of a film taste within quotes. When I joined Presidency College, there was something called the Presidency College Cholachitra Sangshad, which is like the Presidency College Film Club, where I encountered many of the films that I mention in the book. Not just Ray Sen and Ghatok, those I'd watched mostly on Doordarshan, but many of the non-Hollywood, non-Indian films. But really, I hadn't actually considered writing about films in an academic way until I finished my first two books, really. And part of the reason for that, and there's somebody in the audience here today, Ashish Rajadhyaksh. Hi, Ashish, if you're there. It was, on the one hand, having friends who nurtured my interest in cinema, like Ashish, but also this peculiar thing where I realized that, art films, and this will take me to the title of my book, which I call Art Cinema in India's Forgotten Futures, where I realized that oftentimes outside of Bengal, and I was in Chicago, the names of Ray Sen and Ghatak, and many others actually, Adur Gopalakrishnan, even Girish Kasaravali, like Shyam Benegal the least of all, but say MS Satyu, they functioned like ciphers in the sense that, people would say that, yes, these are films that actually bring India a lot of prestige abroad, but really nobody had seen them. And there was also a very influential body of work that was going on when I came of age as I was coming of age as a scholar of cinema, which was sort of finding in popular cinema resources for understanding the workings of Indian democracy. And so it was a weird kind of, an inversion, if you will. So growing up, if there were people who would say, oh, you need not watch mainstream Hindi films, so you need not watch mainstream commercial films, it's too melodramatic, it's too over the top, it's too almost exotic and unreal, all those things that actually take away from respectability. In the academy, there was actually, or certainly when I began to take an academic interest in films, I realized there was a huge interest in the popular. And the truth is, I wasn't particularly interested in, or I wasn't invested, let's put it that way, in the distinctions myself. But how the distinctions actually played out or how they came to be is something that I found very interesting. And that was something that motivated me. So that's the first forgotten in the book, that, who are these people? Who are these people whose names everybody knows? And maybe everyone's seen the Oppu trilogy. And when I say everyone, I don't mean people in Kolkata. I actually mean people elsewhere, both Indian cinephiles, but also abroad. And what kind of film culture was it that produced this distinction between art and commercial in the first place? Second forgotten thing or the second way of forgetting that's very important for me, and that kind of matured, and I'll say this and keep quiet, that came into being as I was working on the book, was that, as you know, the book is not an exhaustive analysis of all the works done by Ray, Ghatak and Sen, right? Those taken together would be over 100. But I was especially interested in the trilogies of each, and not the Oppu trilogy. In Ray's case, I was interested in a city trilogy. In Mrinal Sen's case, I was interested in his contemporaneous Kolkata trilogy. And Ghatak only made Meghe Dhaka Tara, Cloud Cap Star, Shubarna Rekha, the Golden Line, and Komal Gandhar. The Gandhar Sublime is how Moinag Vishwas translates it, E flat. I was interested in these films because to me, they registered what I describe as a sense of disorientation with the post-colonial present, which is to say, and as a historian, I became very interested in understanding that disorientation. So say if in the 50s there was some degree of assurance in looking at where we came from and where we are going, which is to say, looking at the colonial past and onto the post-colonial future. In these trilogies, I sensed this feeling of utter and complete disorientation in very different ways in each of these filmmakers, and a kind of presentism about how to be in this post-colonial present that we inhabit. And that I found very interesting, and that's not how we talk about these filmmakers. So that's the forgetting that I wanted to invoke and discuss in the book. So that's a very long drawn out answer to your brief questions, but does that make sense?
Absolutely. And it leads to my next two questions, after which, feel free to, if you want, turn the questions back on me. The connection you make between the first decade after independence, in the 50s, between a growing sort of idea of the importance of good cinema, within quotes, and citizenship, or post-colonial citizenship, as you put it, and then your kind of interest in the sort of cinema that arises from, this falling off from occupying a citizenly role or persona, if I understood you correctly. And over here, can I just quickly make a literary connection, if that's okay? And then ask you the second part of my question just after that, because I'm responding to everything I read by you, not only as a person who's interested deeply and invested, to use your word, in this kind of, in the practice of Ray and Ghotok and others, but as the investment comes because I'm a practitioner of a particular kind. And so the idea of citizenship has been something that has kind of interested me deeply for a long time. I want to read out this poem. It's called The Novelist it's a sonnet by W.H. Auden. And this is something he was exercised by. And when he says the novelist, he means the 19th century novelist. And he's talking about why is it that the novelist is so different from the poet, and how is it that the novelist came to be this peculiar sort of creature who can do so much, produce books which are 500 pages long. And also, as he says in Letter to Lord Byron, where this preoccupation comes up again, see so deeply into the economic workings of society. This is what he says about Jane Austen, in a way that poets just can't. So I'm just going to read this very short poem, The Novelist. Encased in talent like a uniform, the rank of every poet is well known. They can amaze us like a thunderstorm, or die so young, or live for years alone. They can dash forward like hussars, but the novelist he's referring to, must struggle out of his boyish gift and learn how to be plain and awkward, how to be one after whom none think it worth to turn. So there's nothing unremarkable. There's nothing remarkable, unlike the persona of the poet. There's nothing remarkable outwardly about this, what the novelist seems to be like. For to achieve his lightest wish, he must become the whole of boredom, subject to vulgar complaints like love, among the just be just, among the filthy, filthy too. And in his own weak person, if he can, must suffer dully all the wrongs of man. That is the novelist covering those 500 pages, and he's thinking here about the 19th century novel, must address every character, their motives must be filthy with the filthy, just with the just, become the whole of boredom, because he has to put it all out there, unlike the poet who can choose to kind of magnify only a particular moment and occupy it momentarily. But the novelist can't do that. And so it seems that the novelist is a citizen figure. The novelist has takes on the kind of responsibility that a grown-up does, which is why he says, that he comes out of his talent and then learns how to be plain and awkward, and then take on these huge ambitions of great responsibility of representation. Basically, the novelist is seen to, especially with the 19th century novel, to document society, to represent society. Almost kind of citizenly sort of responsibilities undertaken by the novelist, which are then also participated in by other citizens who read through novels in a very different way from the way they read poems. That is, they read through enlarging their knowledge almost. They almost seem to have learned something at the end of the novel, something new about that society, about those people. With the poet, he seems to think the poet is a non-citizen figure. Living alone, dying young, rushing off like a hussar into the distance, not assimilated. And so so I was interested in your description of this falling off from citizenship, of opting out, as it were, from this particular kind of paradigm of responsibility. That was what it set off in me. It reminded me of. The second thing I was interested. Sorry, these questions are rather long, but I do want you to address them. The second had to do with your word, the word you use, postcolonial, which you use. You use post-colony in the title, and you use postcolonial quite often in the book. I was struck by certain things in the way you use postcolonial, and I was enlivened by it. You say, I think somewhere, that the post-colonial present is multiple. It's not one thing. It's a multiplicity. Of things. It's fragmentary. It seemed sort of something that one could ally with modernism and with art. The art in your title through the investment that modernism and art both have in this kind of multiplicity rather than this integrity. And I thought you were opening up the term in a way that it hasn't been. Maybe it has been by some others, but the dominant term that the dominant meaning of which I'm aware as a writer and as a novelist is the Saidian postcolonial in literature, where, basically we are looking at texts as sort of whether these texts, if you're looking at Western texts, in what way they create a reality, they create the Orient, or represent it or misrepresent it, and in what way rebuttals could be made of that particular exercise of power through language, through representation, which happens in various places, including the novel, through writing, say, to bring back a well-worn term, let's say, to ride back to the empire. So with that Saidian kind of definition of the post-colonial, the kind of work that emerges from the post-colony is seen as a corrective to that exercise of power by the colonizer. It's not really seen in a fabric of its own argumentations and artistic practices and artistic milieus. It's seen more as a setting the pictures, setting the record straight, enlarging or correcting the picture. And I think you over here are doing something slightly different. You have to with Ray and Ghotok and Sen, because they don't lend themselves to this particular definition, the Saidian definition of what a novel does, the post-Saidian definition, I should say. So I'd like you to just maybe respond to these two things.
Okay, I think there are, again, very interesting set of questions. So first is this, I'll try to take them serially in the way that you mentioned. See, because again, Amit, one of the reasons why I hope we'll get into this, I know that for a while, you've been thinking about the role of research, right, in your own writing, and I want to get to that in some ways, because I think the last time that I saw you in person, you said that you were thinking of either writing something, and I don't know if you have, entitled Against Research. And I found that to be very, very provocative, but I'm just putting it out there because I think part of this is also coming from some of those interests. But this whole poetry novel distinction that you drew, and the usefulness of the novel, the uselessness, the so-called uselessness of the poet, and how the novelist, as it were, is the more citizenly figure in a normative sense, right? And to that, you were asking me about what I mean when I say that the project of good cinema and the project of good citizenship got disarticulated. So let me take that lot first. The story that I try to tell in my book is art cinema, the term, the category. When it first arose, it actually coincided with the coming of independence in the country. And from the very beginning, or at least at the beginning, there were a number of individuals, state institutions, other civil social bodies such as film societies who were involved in giving meaning to this project, because there really didn't even exist as a placeholder. So once you come up with a category, you also encrust it with meaning. And in this, I write about Murray Seaton, who was a British film society activist that came to India. The state, there were certain official commissions, etc., that were set up talking about film policy. And there was a lot of cine enthusiasm. And I think, another thing we need to bear in mind is that it wasn't until the early 2000s, I think 2007, when film as a whole was accorded industry status in our country. So film, in a sense, both art, commercial, everything, was like a stepchild to the Indian state. Nevertheless, I think at the moment of independence, many of the people, members of film societies, filmmakers, people involved with the film industry, both in Bombay, Calcutta, Madras, and people who were wannabe filmmakers, there was a certain enthusiasm with the project of building a new future. And that's where I situate the project of art cinema, that it was, even though it wasn't an arm of the state, it shared in some of the state's enthusiasm to look to a future of a particular kind of educated citizen capable of exercising political and aesthetic judgment. Thereafter, the argument I make is that, particularly among some filmmakers, and surely this would have been shared by some, I'm sure, some literateurs, theater personalities, I'm sure this thing would have been shared by many, there was a certain disillusionment, if you will, with the project of modernization and development. And that leads to the kind of disarticulation, as I say, between the project of good citizen making and state making. And here's what I write about it in the book. I say it was as if in the beginning, around 1947, when India became independent, the elite's sense of historical time had a unified character. And when I say elite, I don't necessarily mean an economic elite. It's an elite of education, mainly, and because most of the people that I'm writing about are middle class. Teachers, clerks, office workers, painters, professors, etc. Notwithstanding the ravages of famine, war, and the trauma of partition, history in the new nation had a unified telos for its elites, a narrative of transition to modernity. At the scale of the individual and the nation alike, they were committed to a shared single story, a journey through historical time that included many difficulties and digressions, but a journey whose points of departure and arrival were already known. So if it departed from the colonial period, it had arrived into a moment of liberation in the post-colonial. For its elites, the nation existed as a pedagogical project where you cultivate a certain sensibility, in this case, if only by making good films, giving people the capacity for political and aesthetic judgment. Its cinema was thus conceived in stride. Good films and good cinema were means of creating good and discerning citizen subjects. This book documents how the aspiration to make good films became dislodged from the aspiration to make good citizens. As that relation came undone in the 1960s and 70s, the consensus over historical time that informed the intellectual elites thinking about the post-colonial nation also changed. And I think this brings into question your point about representation. I don't think I was ever talking about representation, and you'll notice I avoid expressions like realism, modernism, because they're extremely freighted expressions. I was talking about the way in which filmmakers apprehended a particular social reality. You can give it whatever name you like. But in a sense, I would say that in the 50s, there was a certain assurance about the narrative arc of the stories that they were telling. I mean, if you take Ray's Opus trilogy, which so many have written about, it's boy becoming man, boy having a future, no matter how uncertain, suffering a lot of losses, but it's a story of becoming. In his city trilogies, by contrast, what you have is a kind of stalled present. And you, in depicting that, I mean, I say that Ray becomes, from a historian, he becomes an ethnographer, where all you can do is take stock of what is going on next to you. So if you want to call this a representation, it's a representation of a present tense without any sense of futurity. So, I mean, I'm interested in the distinction that you drew between the novel and the poem, but to me, the functions of each are not quite as transparent and as sharply demarcated as you made them to be. And really, I think the burden of representing this reality is where you could call it modernist, you could call it, in some ways, an artistic avant-garde sensibility was coming in. It could be realism with a twist. Like I'm not really interested in the aesthetic labels one gives it. What interests me is how people registered their disappointment with the project of modernization and development, and what aesthetic means they deployed to register that sense of disorientation. But I mean, in some ways, I do want to turn this over to you in a certain way. And, again, once you made this remark that you became less interested in Ray from the period that he was making Shatranj Ki Khiladi. And I found it to be a curious statement, and I wanted to ask you if it has something to do with this other project you have, about in this really polemical kind of collocation against research that you have. And do the two come together in your head? And if they do, I'd like to hear a little bit more.
I suppose there are convergences and resonances between these. The statement I'm making here about something to do with my predilections regarding Ray's oeuvre and whatever I might have said about research, there must be continuities between these statements. The comment about research was made in response to a reality which didn't quite exist when Ray was at work, even when he was at work on Shatranj Ki Khiladi. The comment about research was, I suppose, a comment made by a novelist who's been an outsider to this pretty new tradition of the Indian novel in English that one is supposed to be triumphantly a part of, but one feels oneself outside of it, and making sense of one's lack of connectedness to that milieu one is supposed to be part of as a practitioner, and the lack of connectedness in successive waves to do with the emergence of this particular form of the Indian novel in English in the 80s after Midnight's Children, and first grappling with the idea of a tradition which gives, as I said, a fledgling tradition which gives centrality to the novel and to a particular idea of narrative, and Midnight's Children begins to embody those characteristics. And then other waves coming into existence to do with, the rise of the historical novel. And so I've argued against all of those at different points of time. And when I made that comment about research, I must have been the rise of the historical novel and the idea of novelist and researcher becoming interchangeable in the heads of people around me. Everybody by then had heard of the novel, had almost forgotten about it as an entity outside of the Indian novel in English in India. Whether we are talking about the person who's selling pirated novels on the pavement, or the people who are buying those pirated novels, or the latest Booker Prize winner, or people you meet in the academy, there wasn't much difference between them in their acquiescing to the idea that the novel was the central. In fact, literature was the novel. In fact, literature, let's not bother about literature. We only need to engage with the novel. And the novel is something that only exists in English as it's written by Indians. Outside of this kind of world, what's happened in America, or what happened in France 100 years ago, or what happened in Bengali or Kannada is not of direct interest to us in complicating or enriching our idea of narrative or anti-narrative. There were also certain kinds of novels which became, as the 19th century novel became shorthand for the novel at a particular point of time, so that people like Proust or Woolf would have had to work very hard because they were going against the grain of the 19th century novel. And this is where the question of representation comes in, because the 19th century novel is seen as a kind of a vehicle for representation, or for the representational, in as much as that's what it came to be seen to be. Then people who are writing non-narrative, non-representational novels by the early 20th century were having to work hard to make a case for what they were doing. Woolf certainly, because also she's a woman, has to work very, very hard. And that's why she writes criticism. Similarly, a particular kind of novel was now in our heads as a kind of shorthand for not only literature, but for the novel. And around the 2010s onwards, or the 21st century onward, it became the historical novel. And this kind of became a new way of defining to us what it might be to be a postcolonial citizen, and to learn a great deal from the research that goes into these works about these societies, and how these works also correct the biases of the novel, what they leave out, to represent very solidly through research other histories. So the other histories are not approached fragmentarily, but very solidly,
Right.
And with an attitude, I think, of mastery, and with the belief that the past is there. It is there. I only need to go and find out about it in the archive, put it back together, and it's in front of us. I've given it to you in a novel, and then for the reader then is no longer open to other experiences to do with writing, but becomes part of this. Participates in this mastery, in this act of mastery, through narrative. And so I would also offer here, well, I learned so much after reading that novel. It was like attending a class. It was back to your early days, Rochona, of self-improvement, but in a new way, because the world of aspiration after globalization was quite different from before.
Right.
Globalization.
Yeah.
So it was all.
I think I want to come in. Yeah, I want to come in here and kind of say earlier. This is responding to your question about representation and the post-Saidian moment. So here's where I think my project differs, and I owe a lot to what is often referred to as the Chicago film history, or the new film history. Where one would say that film is not just about representation. Like, it's not saying that, oh, I watched this movie and this was a very true depiction of life in a village in so-and-so place. but rather you want to think of film as an embodiment of a particular sensory experience of modernity. So to take a concrete example, and I mentioned disorientation earlier, right? I mean, if you go back to that particular scene from Ray's adversary, Protidwandi, there's a scene where Siddhartha, played by Dhritiman, has a job interview, and he's bombed the interview, and he goes into a cinema hall, metro actually, and it's air conditioned. He just sits down and he thinks that I'm going to rest from this really hot day, and a bomb goes off. As there's the films division documentaries start rolling on screen, and there's a bomb that goes off, and people just start piling out, and in the sort of scramble, his watch breaks. Now, a lot gets packed into that scene, right? So if somebody watching that scene, like, you can't possibly say I learned a lot, because it begs the question of, well, what did you learn? I mean, what was this job interviewee doing who goes into the theater to rest? What kind of youth goes into the theater to rest? I mean, in other words, this is not about a transparent representation of a reality out there, because the reality out there is so confusing and so puzzling that it's as if the filmmaker says that I refuse to actually give it to you neatly wrapped in a package which you can then process and swallow. Rather, my task is to be alert to the atmospherics of that situation and show it as I'm seeing it, and then let's see where it goes from here. I mean, a lot of people have said that the ending of The Adversary, with the Ramnam Sathe and him finding the bird call at the end, is a nice, neat resolution. Now, I don't know that it is. And I don't think that this is actually an interpretive muscle flexing, but it goes back again to the function that you task cinema or theater or literature with. And I think I get what you mean when you say against research, because this is something that would be in common, say, even though you're 30 years later or many years later after these people. It's not as if people undertook research first and then sat down to write. Research is an ongoing process that happens if you're alert to your surroundings. It happens all the time. I mean, of course, as a historian, I have certain methods. And in this book, I deploy certain methods to recover certain archives. They're not state archives. They're extremely ephemeral archives of film societies. But again, I have to decode them to see what aspirations they embody. Like, why would a group of people, about 100,000, I think, at its height of the film society movement, why would they be so invested in watching non-Hollywood, non-Indian language films, or non-mainstream Indian language films, and that too under terrible conditions, like where they had to source films. So it was a certain, if one wants to call that aspiration research, I'm interested in the names, but you see, that's why I was asking you this.
Yes.
But you didn't get to the Shatranj part, which I remain curious about.
Yes. By the way, I completely agree with you about these films that you're talking about. Or sorry, I must look for another word besides representation. But your representation of Protidwandi or Shima Badhor, whatever, I agree with the way they are put together, which is why I like them. I mean, I love the early films, Ray's early films, very much, but I also love these films, and this is the reason that they are not solidly put together, and you don't feel that watching them is a kind of quasi form of knowledge. I used to get this question: "Oh, you're a novelist. You must do a lot of research at a certain point of time," from people I didn't know, but who would have heard that I'm a novelist, and I would say to them, yes, I do research all the time. I mean, which something you just mentioned. So the idea of research as kind of something you do for a particular product which is the book, is the model that I have a problem with. Research is something different from that, if we have to use the word at all. Now, as far as Ray is concerned, the Shatranj Ki Khiladi, let me just quickly say that, I had in my mind a periodization. So there were these early films. When I looked at his filmography today, I found that some of the things that I thought belonged to different periods or happened, consecutively or one before after the other, sometimes happened simultaneously. But the periodization I had in my head was the early films, then the middle period, and then this period of Shatranj Ki Khiladi. This man I knew, father of a friend of mine, Dhruvo Gupta, had his own period. A great lover of cinema, but historian, great enthusiast of African literature. He had his own, you would know him. He had his own periodization too. And one of the things that said to me also spoke to my own sort of sense of the periodization I had in my head. And he said, with Arunne Din Ratri, the reception that Ray got made him lose his nerve in terms of what he was doing. Therefore, he produced Oshoni Shankit. This was his kind of analysis, which I thought very funny and very interesting. So he was saying that I believe Ray was never, whatever his manner, he was never comfortably a citizen. Certainly not in his early films, not in his middle period. There is just the early films could be a Bildungsroman, but they are an example, just as Bibhuti-Bhushan's book is, of how one might take on the subject matter of a Bildungsroman, but write about something, do something different, explore consciousness, which is what I think Bibhuti-Bhushan is doing, and which is what I think Ray is doing. And therefore, just as the non-citizen or the one resistant to citizenship is not easily assimilable, these early films also have all kinds of non-assimilable bits, longers, for the want of a better word. Like, for instance, the famous scene where there are insects in a pond during the monsoons, and he just spends a huge amount of time on those insects, which by the standards of any cinema and the standards of any financier would be inadmissible. But he's taking his cue from Renoir from an early film, Un Parti de Campagne, where he begins to spend a huge amount of time in what is just a half-an-hour film, I think, on the currents of water as it rains, as they're going on this boat ride in the river. And Renoir himself might be taking his cue from what Monet began to do with his water lilies. Work, rework, and produce one version after another of a watery fluid scene, versions which no longer remain distinct from the other. And all these are instances of the difficult to assimilate. And so they resist assimilation. And I think Ray is coming from a number of provenances, intellectual provenances, in his rejection of being easily assimilable, whatever his positions about new art films might have been later on. His kind of unfair criticism, if it did happen, of Mani Kaul, a filmmaker I greatly admire, and with whom he has a shared temperament. I'm sad that this all, his relationship with the other filmmakers and younger filmmakers become kind of situated in a kind of family quarrel. I love one or the other. This is my, so not in your book, I'm saying in general.
But I think, but at the same time, it gave this period a certain richness. Of course it did. That kind of family quarrel, that kind of almost blood feud, if you will, I don't think has been repeated in Indian cinema circles. And you fight about something when you actually make it, when it becomes the bearer of many aspirations. And you asked about, what do you mean by the postcolonial? I think you just answered it. It's actually when you can claim as the subject of free and independent India, you can claim multiple provenances for your practice. In fact, you don't even want to be constrained by saying, which one your provenance is, and you don't have to. It does not bear the burden of taking from somebody else, particularly the ex-colonizer. That's certainly one aspect of what I would regard to be central to the postcolonial stance, where there's a sense of openness. You see this in a lot of third cinema work, which is supposed to be, say, the Latin American third cinema, where they're taking from Cine Regionale, they're taking from Chris Marker, they're taking from Newsreel. All kinds of people. So it's almost like protean borrowings, but not even with a sense of borrowing, because you then put it to a different use. I think where I would push back a little is on this question of why does any of this have to be divorced from the idea of citizenship? If by citizenship we don't mean, taking an oath of allegiance to the military of the United States Army, or in this case, whatever, the Indian Constitution, but rather if it's the capacity to be the bearers of political and aesthetic critical judgment, then why would this not be? Why would good film or good theater or good literature not be allied to the project of making good citizens? I don't understand why you would be resistant to that.
So what about questions?
This is from Manas Ray. Do you think that the category art cinema needs to be problematized in the first place? It seems to think that in the self-definition, it is hugely loaded with what it is not or should not be. This is the so-called commercial popular. This differential category on which art cinema is premised on gives it a certain kind of ring to it, the privileging of the persona of the aesthete practicing and patronizing it, a certain politics of reception. While the depiction of a certain kind of cinema as art cinema rarefies art and artistic practice, it also castigates the popular as one monolithic mass. Talking about shaping of nations' future and the associated disappointments, one could perhaps argue that was not only art cinema's burden. Popular cinema, for instance, the Uttam Charita melodramas took part in it.
Yeah, the thing is, I should make it very clear that the category art cinema is not, my book is not either celebrating or endorsing it. What I am invested in is in understanding what work it is doing in the post-independence context from 1947 up until maybe a few years after the emergency. And there's no quarrel, I think, about the proposition that all kinds of films, whether it's Uttam Shuchitra, whether it's Gurudutt, whether it's Raj Kapoor, everybody is taking on the burden of thinking about the post-colonial situation. My brief that I set for myself in this book is to understand the particular way in which the body of films that we designate as art films do that. That is not to say that I'm blind to certain biases that these filmmakers might have, let's say, towards the popular. But in a sense, that's what I try to understand, that, what's at stake, in other words, in these projects. Like, why would, because these are, as you know, these are filmmakers who didn't just make films. They wrote as much on films. They organized about films. In fact, Adur Gopalakrishnan once made this great comment to me where he said that, I set up a film club first because I wanted to cultivate a particular kind of audience and then make the films that I wanted to make, because I'd be assured of an audience. They experimented with particular production models. They were the early people, and I'm not just talking about Raisin and Ghotok here. I'm talking about people like Adur, later on John Abraham, who experimented with a cooperative model of filmmaking. So It's actually a certain kind of thinking which sought to distinguish itself from the mainstream commercial cinema and got into quarrels oftentimes with each other. I mean, that's why you then have the splintering of the art film into middle cinema, parallel cinema, the artistic avant-garde of Kaul and Shahani. I mean, it's, just as commercial cinema is not a monolith, so too is art cinema not a monolith. So that I want to be very clear on. This book is a history of the career of the term in the Indian context during a particular time.
We have one comment and one question. This is the question is for Amit. The comment first from Prabhu Mudlapur. If you have read Bashir, the Malayalam writer, he's not to be labeled aligning with citizenship, etc. Life is wonderful and diverse, and hence literature or films. The next the question is from Pravina Cooper, and this is for you, Amit. Even the aesthetic movements that you validate, Renoir's water, etc., carry political and in brackets citizenship undertones. Correct?
Okay, so can I, before I try and reply to that, can I just ask Rochona a question? What do you think is happening now to the art house cinema movement in India, and why is it not as robust as it used to be, and why is it not as robust as it is, let us say, in other countries, including, say, Iran or China?
You'll notice, Amit, in the book, I never say art house, because if you talk about art house, we didn't have them. I mean, Nandon came up in the 1980s. And I think I give a statistic in the book where we have our first so-called art house in Kolkata. So I write, one of the first and few art house theatres, Nandon, was established in Calcutta as late as 1985, 38 years after independence. As a point of comparison, by 1950, there were 80 such theatres in America, a number that rose to 450 by 1963. So it's really in the context of developmental scarcity that I found it fascinating to look back on these people, so many of whom remain anonymous, to watch, to watch movies. I mean, I have anecdotes in the book of how Nazarene, for example, arrived in Kolkata on its way to Burma, I think, and how they had it for an evening and the conditions in which they watched it, I think in Tiger or one of the cinema halls. It's no longer called Tiger. I think it's called Chaplin now. Now, that's the history that I wanted to understand a little. What has happened to it now? I don't know. I do not work on the contemporary, but one thing I can say, and again, I think Ashish's forthcoming book will be a very useful one here. I think for a lot of people who are currently making films, even in what we call Bollywood, for many of them, particularly those that trained at places like FTII, the body of filmmakers that I'm referring to here, not just the Indian ones, but also the non-Indian ones, they are legatees of those filmmakers. I mean, Ashish has this beautiful article on Kundan Shah and his Janebi Do Yaro, where he talks about Shah's kind of tongue-in-cheek debt to Antonioni. And I think that my positive spin is that for a lot of people now, things are much more easily available, and it's much more easily a part of their legacy. My not so positive spin on it is that, since the coming of the multiplex, I don't think that the distinction between art and commercial works in quite the same way, because we talk about niche audiences, right? And they cater to, there's something in them for everybody. I think that that's largely true. I mean, I wouldn't know so much about Iran, but I think that that's largely true in most viewing contexts of the world, where you have many more festivals, many more screening opportunities, and of course your OTT platforms, which actually bring everything to your house. So it's a different kind of screening climate. And the last thing I'd say is, frankly, I don't know what the future of cinema understood in this big way, as not just films, but a kind of public sphere surrounding films, writing, theatrical, non-theatrical screenings, debates, discussions. What the status of cinema understood in this expanded sense is in not just the digital universe, but also in the post-COVID universe. I don't know how COVID is going to rewrite these communities. So that's not a very exact answer, but that's some of my thoughts on this.
So I think Praveena Cooper made a comment, but I'm going to kind of look at the comment as an opportunity to approach it slightly differently. I mean, whatever it was possible that allowed Renoir to take those 2 minutes or so in the movie to show us this is also